We often think about getting sick as like you get one bug, you get one problem, right?
Right.
But it's way more complicated than that.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when you look at areas that have a lot of different health issues going on at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at a study about malaria in Venezuela. And as you know, malaria is a big deal globally.
Yeah.
But when you add in other infections on top of malaria, things can get really tricky.
Absolutely.
It impacts how you figure out what's wrong, how you treat it, and in the end, it can really affect how well people recover.
Definitely. And Venezuela in particular has seen a concerning increase in malaria cases lately.
Right.
So understanding all the pieces of the puzzle there is really important.
Absolutely. So the study we're looking at today focuses on malaria patients in a specific part of southern Venezuela.
Okay.
It's a place called Ciudad Bolivar, and it's known for having a lot of malaria. And the researchers wanted to find out how common it is for these patients to have also been exposed to other infections, like viruses and bacteria.
So they weren't just looking at malaria in isolation.
Exactly.
They were looking at the bigger picture.
Right. So to do this, they used a method called seroprevalence.
Okay.
Basically, they looked for antibodies in the patient's blood.
I see.
Antibodies are like little flags that your immune system puts up.
Right.
They show whether you've had an infection in the past or if you're fighting one off right now.
Uh-huh.
So they look for antibodies for things like dengue virus, chikungunya virus,
Okay.
hepatitis A, B, and C, and also leptospirosis.
Gotcha. So it's like checking the body's records to see what it's encountered before.
Exactly. It's like reading the immune system's history book.
I like that.
So our mission today is to break down what this study found about these co-infections.
Right.
We want to understand how common they are in this region of Venezuela, what it means for dealing with malaria there. And we're going to do this in a way that's clear and easy to understand.
Sounds good.
So let's get started.
All right, let's dive in.
Where do you want to start?
Well, let's first take a look at how the study was designed.
Okay.
As you mentioned, they focused on Ciudad Bolivar, which is the capital of Bolivar state in Venezuela.
Right.
And this region has a long history as a malaria hotspot.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a problem there for a long time.
It has.
And the researchers worked with 3 main medical centers in the city.
Good. So who are the people participating in this study?
So there were 161 malaria patients,
Okay.
all over the age of 12,
Mm.
and they all had a confirmed malaria diagnosis.
All right.
Now, what's interesting is the breakdown of the types of malaria they had.
Okay. Tell me more.
Most of them, about 66%, had Plasmodium vivax,
Okay.
which is a type of malaria that's often considered less severe,
Right.
but still a serious health concern, of course.
Absolutely.
About 27% had P. falciparum, which is the more dangerous type of malaria.
It is.
And a smaller group, about 7.5%, had infections with both P. vivax and P. falciparum.
That makes sense, that you could have both at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about the severity of the illness.
Absolutely. It can definitely complicate the picture.
It does. So how did they figure out who had other infections on top of malaria?
Well, they were looking for these things called co-infections.
Right.
Or recent exposure, which they called core.
Okay.
And they looked for specific types of antibodies.
Right. Those little flags.
Exactly. So for dengue,
Mhm.
chikungunya, hepatitis A and C, and leptospirosis,
Okay.
the presence of IgM antibodies, or both IgM and IgG, suggested a recent or current infection.
Okay.
Now, IgM antibodies are usually the first ones to show up when your body encounters a new infection.
So they're like the first responders of the immune system.
Exactly. They're like the initial alarm bells going off.
Gotcha.
And for hepatitis B, they did things a bit differently. They looked for the hepatitis B surface antigen, which is a direct sign of an active infection.
So it's like seeing the virus itself, essentially.
Pretty much. And they defined previous exposure as having IgG antibodies without any of the more recent IgM antibodies.
Okay, so IgG is like the long-term memory of the immune system.
Exactly. It sticks around longer, indicating a past encounter with the infection.
Makes sense.
And it's important to note that everyone in the study also had a full clinical evaluation
Okay.
and blood tests to get a complete picture of their health.
Great. So they did a pretty thorough job.
Yeah, they were very comprehensive.
Okay, so with all that background, what did they find?
Well, the first big finding is that a significant number of malaria patients had evidence of corors.
Okay, how many are we talking?
About 34% of the malaria patients showed signs of having or having had another infection at the same time.
Wow, that's more than a third.
Yeah, it is.
So I wouldn't have guessed it would be that high.
It's a pretty significant number. So right off the bat, we see that a lot of people with malaria in this region are also dealing with something else.
It's not just a single infection.
Exactly.
So did this rate of co-infection vary depending on which type of malaria the person had?
It did, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Cohorum was significantly more frequent in patients with P. falciparum.
The more dangerous kind.
Right. In that group, about 49% had evidence of another infection,
Okay.
compared to about 29% in those with P. vivax.
So less than half as much.
Exactly. And only around 25% in those with mixed infections.
So it seems like P. falciparum is really linked to a higher risk of having another infection at the same time.
It does.
Did they quantify that at all?
Yeah, they did. They calculated what's called an odds ratio,
Okay.
and it was 2.43.
So what does that mean for people who aren't statisticians?
It means that patients with P. falciparum were more than twice as likely to have another infection compared to those with P. vivax.
So it's not just a small difference.
No, it's a pretty significant jump in risk.
That is significant. So of all the possible infections, which ones were the most common in these malaria patients?
The most frequent one was dengue virus.
Okay.
It showed up in about 15% of the malaria patients.
All right. What about the others?
Next was hepatitis A virus
Yeah.
at around 12%.
Okay.
Then hepatitis B at 6.2%.
Uh-huh.
Chikungunya virus at 5.5%.
Right.
And leptospirosis at 3.7%.
So a whole range of different pathogens.
Yeah, quite a mix.
Did they find anyone with hepatitis C?
Actually, no. They didn't find any evidence of recent exposure to hepatitis C virus in this group.
Interesting. So it wasn't just one extra infection in some cases, right?
Yeah.
Some people had multiple co-infections.
Yeah, you're right.
Like more than one extra thing going on.
While most people with co-infections only had one extra pathogen,
Okay.
there were some cases where people had two or even three.
Wow.
So there were some different combinations they found,
Like what?
like dengue and hepatitis A,
Okay.
dengue and chikungunya,
Uh-huh.
hepatitis A and B,
Right.
hepatitis A and leptospirosis,
Okay.
chikungunya and leptospirosis,
Right.
and dengue and leptospirosis.
Wow. So a lot of possible combinations.
Yeah, it really shows how complex these infections can be.
It does. And were there any cases of people with 3 infections at once?
There were actually 2 cases of people with 3 co-infections.
Oh, wow.
One person had dengue, chikungunya, and hepatitis A altogether,
Oh, my goodness.
and another person had dengue, chikungunya, and leptospirosis.
Wow. So this is getting really complicated.
It is, and interestingly, both of those individuals worked in mining.
Oh, okay.
So their occupation might have played a role in their exposure to multiple pathogens.
That makes sense. If you're working outdoors, you're probably more likely to come into contact with different bugs and things.
Absolutely.
So where were most of these patients living?
Most of them were from 2 specific areas,
Hmm.
the Cifuentes and Hears municipalities within Bolivar State.
Mm.
And there's an interesting connection here between P. falciparum infections and the Cifuentes municipality.
Really?
Yeah. This is where a lot of mining happens.
Right.
And like I said, the miners had a high prevalence of core.
So their work puts them at higher risk for these co-infections.
It seems that way.
It seems like they're just exposed to more pathogens in general.
Yeah, that's a likely explanation.
What about hepatitis A?
Yeah, good question.
Was that linked to any particular location?
They did find a higher frequency of hepatitis of the virus core in the Hears municipality.
Interesting. So maybe something specific about that area is contributing to the spread of hepatitis A.
All right.
And remember, they mentioned that a lot of people in the study hadn't been exposed to hepatitis A before.
Yeah.
So that could point to problems with water quality or low vaccination rates.
Yeah.
That's a big public health concern,
It is.
especially on top of malaria.
Definitely.
So we see that co-infections are common.
Yeah.
There are some geographical and occupational links. But what does all this mean for how malaria actually shows up in these patients?
Good question. So while everyone had the usual malaria symptoms like fever, chills, and headache,
Right.
there were some interesting links between specific co-infections and other clinical signs.
Okay. Like what?
Well, dengue co-infection was linked to things like asthenia,
Which is...
which is basically extreme tiredness and weakness.
Oh, okay.
They also had cough, an enlarged spleen, and somnolence,
Somnolence.
which means excessive sleepiness.
Ah, okay.
So basically, they were really tired and sleepy.
That makes sense.
So dengue was making those malaria symptoms worse.
Right.
What about the other co-infections?
Yeah.
Were they linked to anything specific? Yeah, they were.
Mm-hmm.
Hepatitis B co-infection, for example, was associated with lower pallor.
Which is what?
Pallor's when you look really pale.
Okay.
It's often linked to anemia, which is a lack of red blood cells.
I see.
So having hepatitis B on top of malaria seemed to make them less pale, which is kind of the opposite of what you might expect.
It is.
Then there's hepatitis A.
Right.
And this one is a bit worrying.
Okay, why?
It was linked to more severe neurological symptoms.
Oh, no.
Like stupor and seizures.
So their brain function was being affected. That's
Yeah.
really serious.
It is. And finally, leptospirosis co-infection seemed to have a broader impact.
Okay. In what way?
It was associated with lower red blood cell and platelet counts,
Okay.
elevated liver enzymes.
Which means?
Basically, their liver wasn't functioning as well as it should.
Okay.
And they also had low potassium levels.
So it was affecting multiple systems in the body.
Yeah, leptospirosis seemed to have a more widespread effect.
So we see these co-infections can really change how malaria manifests in a person.
Right.
Did they also find that it affected how severe the malaria became?
Yes, this is another really important finding.
Okay, tell me more.
Complicated malaria was much more common in patients who also had a co-infection.
Complicated meaning?
It means the malaria has progressed and is causing more serious problems.
Like what kind of problems?
Things like jaundice, cerebral malaria, severe anemia,
Right.
fluid in the lungs, or kidney failure.
So really life-threatening complication.
Exactly. It can be very serious.
Wow. So how much more common was it in people with co-infections?
Well, around 56% of patients with co-infections developed complicated malaria,
Okay.
compared to about 36% of those who just had malaria alone.
So almost double.
It's a big difference. And they also calculated an odds ratio for this, which was 2.31.
So again, more than twice as likely to develop these severe complications if you have a co-infection.
That's right. It really highlights how important it is to be aware of these co-infections.
It does. But hold on, didn't we say earlier that P. falciparum malaria is more likely to cause severe illness on its own?
You're right, we did.
So could that be influencing these results?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's possible that the higher rate of co-infection in P. falciparum cases is partly why we see more complicated malaria in that group.
Yeah, the researchers acknowledge that.
It makes sense. P. falciparum is just more dangerous overall.
Right. But even with that in mind, the statistically significant association they found still suggests that co-infections likely play a role in making malaria more severe.
So it's probably a combination of factors.
Yeah, most likely. But we need more research to fully understand how these things interact.
It's complicated.
It is.
So how do these findings compare to what we know about co-infections in other parts of the world where malaria is a problem?
Well, they compared their findings to studies from Africa, Southeast Asia, and other parts of Latin America like Brazil and India. And they found that the rates of co-infection really vary from place to place.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
No, not at all.
Every region is unique.
Exactly. So, for example, the 34% co-infection rate in this Venezuelan study was higher than what was reported in a study in Brazil,
Oh,
but lower than what was found in a study in India.
so it's all over the map.
Pretty much.
Why do you think there are these regional differences?
Well, there are probably lots of reasons.
Like what?
For dengue, the high co-infection rate in Venezuela might be because dengue is very common in the region.
Uh-huh.
And they've had some big dengue outbreaks in the past.
Right, so there's a lot of dengue virus circulating.
Exactly.
What about hepatitis A?
For hepatitis A, they think it might be linked to problems with water and sanitation in Venezuela
Okay.
and possibly low vaccination rates.
Right, because remember they found that a lot of people hadn't been exposed to hepatitis A before.
Exactly.
So that suggests a lack of immunity in the population.
Right.
And leptospirosis.
Well, that one was lower in this study compared to some other places.
Ah,
But there's a catch.
what's that?
Another study in the same area found a high prevalence of leptospirosis among people with fever, regardless of whether they had malaria.
So leptospirosis is still a problem there, even if it's not always showing up alongside malaria.
Yeah, it's definitely circulating in the population.
And for dengue and chikungunya,
Yeah.
do they have any theories about why they might be so common?
Well, they think it might be because the mosquitoes that transmit those viruses breed in the same places as the malaria mosquitoes.
So if you have one type of mosquito, you're likely to have the others as well.
Pretty much.
So it's this whole interconnected ecosystem of diseases.
Exactly.
It's not just about one bug, one problem.
No, it's way more complicated than that.
It is. Now, like with any research study, there are always limitations.
Right.
Things we need to keep in mind when we're interpreting the findings.
Absolutely.
So what were some of the limitations of this study?
Well, one thing is that they didn't do repeat testing for the viral infections.
Okay, so they only had one snapshot in time.
Right.
They didn't track how the antibody levels changed over time.
Exactly.
Okay.
They also mentioned the possibility of cross-reactivity in the antibody tests.
Which is?
Basically because malaria itself can cause a big immune response. It's possible that some of the positive results for other infections were false positives.
So the test might have reacted to something other than the specific virus it was looking for.
Right. It could have been picking up on something else triggered by the malaria.
That's really important to consider.
It shows how tricky these tests can be in a situation where there are multiple infections going on.
Were there any other limitations they pointed out?
Yeah, a few more.
Okay.
They didn't have paired blood samples from the beginning and end of the illness.
So they couldn't compare how the antibody levels changed over the course of the infection.
Right.
Gotcha.
They also weren't able to use molecular tests, which are more precise
Okay.
and could have confirmed the presence of multiple infections.
Right.
And they only included people who had fever and a confirmed malaria diagnosis.
So we don't know anything about co-infections in people who might have had malaria without symptoms.
Right. It's possible there were other people with co-infections who weren't included in the study.
That's true. And any other limitations?
Yeah, the last one is that the numbers for some of the specific co-infection combinations were pretty small.
Okay.
So it's hard to draw firm conclusions about their impact.
Right. They need more data.
They do. And they also didn't look at other common diseases in the region.
So there might be other pathogens involved that they didn't even test for.
That's right. It's a complex picture.
It is. So taking all of this into account, what are the big takeaways from this study?
Well, the main things to remember are that co-infections are common in malaria patients in this part of Venezuela,
Right.
especially dengue and hepatitis A.
Okay.
And they're even more frequent in people with P. falciparum malaria.
The more dangerous kind.
Right. And importantly, having a co-infection significantly increases the risk of developing complicated malaria.
With those really serious complications.
Exactly.
And it can also change how malaria presents itself.
Right, it can cause different symptoms and affect different organ systems.
So it's really important for healthcare workers in these areas to be aware of this.
Absolutely. They need to be thinking about co-infections, especially if a patient has unusual symptoms or isn't responding to treatment as expected.
Right. What seems like a simple case of malaria could actually be much more complex.
Exactly.
And the researchers are calling for more research in this area.
Yeah, they want to see more studies using better diagnostic tools and looking at different stages of infection.
So we can really understand the impact of these co-infections.
Right.
And ultimately, how to better manage and treat them.
Exactly.
So it's fascinating how what we might think of as one disease, malaria, is often intertwined with a whole web of other infections.
Yeah,
And that can lead to much more severe consequences for people's health.
definitely. It highlights the interconnectedness of these health challenges.
It does, and it makes you think about the bigger picture.
In what way?
Well, if we know that co-infections are so common in this region,
Yeah,
how do we need to change our public health strategies?
that's a great question.
Should we be doing more to look for multiple pathogens at the same time?
It's definitely something to consider.
Should we be testing for a wider range of infections in people with malaria?
Yeah, maybe we need to broaden our diagnostic approach.
And should treatment protocols be adapted to take into account the possibility of co-infections?
It seems like that would be a smart move.
Yeah, because treating just the malaria might not be enough if there's something else going on as well.
Right. It really challenges us to think more holistically about how we approach these complex health issues.
It does, and it's something we need to consider not just in Venezuela, but in other malaria endemic regions around the world.
Absolutely. It's a global challenge.
It is. So that brings us to the end of our deep dive today.
It was a fascinating one.
It was, and I hope it's given you a better understanding of the complexities of malaria and the importance of considering co-infections.
I think it has.
Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.